we please welcome Kyle Griffith.
Alrighty, so thank y'all for having me. It looks like a great turnout today as well. I'm very happy about that. So, but to get started, so a great introduction. I appreciate that very much. Alrighty, so I'll get started on a little outline. So before we get into everything, so just so you know what you're going to hear. And so I'll go over the inspiration for this talk, a little bit about what's going on at the museum first, and then I'll go over some of the early perceptions that people had for how colonists saw Virginia and how that's different than today, as well as a brief biography into some of the surveyors of the time, Joshua Fry and Fry-Jefferson, as well as some comparisons of the map itself. I will zoom in and show you kind of what things were and what they are today and how they've changed over time. And then to end, a little bit of an extra information about the Jefferson family. I think they're very fascinating, and I've done extra research, and especially they've actually moved down to where I'm from as well. There's a branch of the Jeffersons who I'd like to tell you all about. So, but like I said, to get into the inspiration behind this project, so in the Rising Sun Tavern, we are lucky enough to have what is a 1760s reprint of the original 1750s Fry-Jefferson map. So very rare, as from what I've heard, there's only about, I believe, 20 of these that exist or less than that. So very rare piece, and ours was actually cut into 4 different sections. Originally it was drawn as one. So recently, we had curtains in this room. It was a very dark room. We were trying to protect the paper. And so, but recently we noticed, the frames were a little old now, and we needed to not only reframe them, but put new UV protected glass in that. So we've done that. We sent it to Alexandria. It's done very well, and we've received them back and hung them on the wall. And so you can see them now if you go. They're actually in the bright light now. You can actually see them. And so we wanted to kind of draw attention to these maps and share a little bit more about them, since it's such a rare artifact that we have here in Fredericksburg. So that's a little bit of the background. So, but into some of the early perceptions of Virginia. So, of course, this is Virginia as we know it today. But in the 18th century, a lot of people only really knew the Tidewater region. And, I'll go over a couple of the maps first. But before the 1750s, they really had not moved into the Piedmont area of Virginia. They were beginning to do that. They were settling the area that I'm from, but there was no map of that area yet. And anything that was a map, it was, plat maps, very small sections, not an overall view. So if you wanted to go west of this point, there was also no main roads, of course. So there was one main road I'll go over, but for the most part in the Fry-Jefferson map, there are no roads, it's just rivers. And so I'll go over a little bit of this. So some of the very early maps in the 1600s, some of them are not oriented to where north is at the top. In fact, they look at it this way. They've arrived and Virginia is at the top. So it's kind of west oriented. So you can kind of see how we know it today. This is one of the original maps. You can compare. I'm going to slowly transition to it so you can see a map from the 1670s and their understanding of Virginia. It's the same view, but you see it's very accurate as well for what it is. This is one of the very early accurate maps in 1670 by Augustine Hermann, who was from Bohemia. But you can see they only knew up to what is about Richmond today, and everything else was uncharted. So for the reason behind making the map in the first place, so if you can imagine in England, we're approaching conflicts with France. So we're also trying to battle to get the Ohio River Valley area. So, but like I'm saying, there's no map of that area, and so in England they can't really plan strategically and know where the territories lie exactly. So the Earl of Halifax, who I have a picture of on the side, George Montague Dunk, he is the original person that kind of commissioned this map. So he was the president of the Board of Trade in England. And in 1749, 1750 time period, he found the need for this map. So he reached out to the colonies, and there was an order from each colony, the governor to send in a map of their colony. So this was the beginnings of this. And so they needed to search within the colonies to find the most able persons in Virginia. And so that fell to then the acting governor, Lewis Burwell, who did find those two people. So that was in 1751. I will go over a little bit more into those people. So the surveyors, and first, before I talk about them, I want to kind of preface it with what they continued. So to pick up, I have a quote here from Thomas Jefferson, as well as a photo or a painting of Colonel William Byrd II. So if you all know a little bit about him. So Thomas Jefferson wrote that about his father, he was chosen with Joshua Fry to continue the boundary line between Virginia and North Carolina, which had been begun by Colonel Byrd. So that was in 1728. And afterwards employed with the same Mr. Fry to make the first map of Virginia which had ever been made, that of Captain John Smith's being merely a conjectural sketch. So that's referencing the early Jamestown maps, very loosely based on reality. And so a little bit more into that, like I mentioned. So Joshua Fry, and as well I'll mention, before I started up here, I had a very nice lady come up to me and says she was a descendant of Joshua Fry. So that's very fascinating to me. And she gave me a little bit of information as well that I plan to throw in here alongside this. So, but a brief biography of Joshua Fry. So he was born about 1699, and he was born in England first off, but he moved to Virginia when he was about 26. Moved to Essex County. Well, actually, first he moved here originally to be a professor at William and Mary. He was a professor of mathematics, also of English, and a couple other things for about 10 years. Then he married into a wealthy family, so he married a widow of the Hill family, and he acquired all of her estate and her land holdings and stuff like that. So that's really how he got his initial wealth. And then so he became a justice of the peace and a sheriff in Essex County for a while, before he then moved out to Albemarle. So he was one of the very early settlers of Albemarle, like Peter Jefferson. He also served in the House of Burgesses. But 1749 is when he did his original survey I'm talking about today. And then by 1754, after the map, he was appointed by Governor Dinwiddie as colonel of the Virginia Regiment. So afterwards, shortly after that, he was actually on a mission up to the Ohio. And on the way within Maryland, he fell off his horse and he got injured from that, and he actually passed away. And he was replaced by George Washington. So Colonel George Washington is who replaced him, and I've got a depiction of that, Colonel George Washington as the colonel of the Virginia Regiment on the side. But to throw in some of this information, I learned that from the information the lady provided me that Joshua Fry's home was called Viewmont, and I'll point it out on the map as well later. And they actually had a really good bond with with Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson wrote another fact about them. He said, "My father had a devoted friend to whose house he would go dine, spend the night, dine with him on the second day, and return to Shadwell in the evening. His friend in the course of a day would return the visit." So this occurred once every week. They were together 4 days out of 7. So Fry and Jefferson were really good friends, and they were together a lot. And then one last little bit about him, about when he died. It's noted that when he died, George Washington carved on a tree, "Under this oak tree lies the body of the good, the just, and the noble Fry." So it also reflects on how George Washington viewed him and respected him as well, especially to succeed him. So that's just a brief biography on Joshua Fry. He has a very extensive life that I could have made the whole presentation about. But a little more on Peter Jefferson as well. So he was born around 1708 in a little place near what's now Richmond called Osborne's, which is Osborne's Landing. It's still signs pointing to it. But he was born into a wealthy-ish family, but not so much as probably the rest of the people I'll talk about today. But his father served as the sheriff of Henrico County, also the captain of the militia and the justice of the peace for that area. But by 1738, Peter Jefferson married into the Randolph family. So, of course, they were huge landowners as well. So that's a lot of where his wealth came from as well. So they moved over to Albemarle like Joshua Fry did. He was one of the very early settlers, either the third or the fourth settler of that area, according to Thomas Jefferson's writings. And so about 10 years later, that's when he did the survey. After that, he served as county surveyor, burgess, and also lieutenant of militia, so very similar to Joshua Fry. And then as well, he died very soon after the map. Both of them died very soon after, from an illness at Shadwell, which was his home, and that's named after where they come from in England, Shadwell. So like I said, very brief overview of their lives, but I want to get into the details of the map if I can. So, and then again, a reference to William Byrd, like I mentioned. So William Byrd did the Virginia-North Carolina boundary line in 1728. So this is a depiction of where he surveyed. He started at the Great Dismal Swamp, and he walked west 237 miles to a very specific blazed red oak tree on the east bank of Peters Creek. So it's what's now Patrick County. And so Peter and Jefferson and Joshua Fry picked up the end of that survey. They started where he left off. They went 90 more miles west into what's now Washington County. It's not the current edge of the state, but that is what kind of started this whole map. That was their first step. And then eventually they did the rest of the state. So to continue, this finally is the whole map. So, and it's been called the first map of Virginia by Virginians. So very important for that reason as well. That's especially impactful, I think. But before I start talking about the details of the map itself, look down in the bottom right corner, very detailed what's called a cartouche. And before I get into the drawing itself, the name of the map is very important because this is not just Virginia. This is what they call a map of the most inhabited part of Virginia, containing the whole province of Maryland with part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and North Carolina. So a bit of everything. And it does date to 1751, although it was first published in 1753. So that's a little bit, can be confusing. And a little further down, this is actually a colorized version of it. Some maps colorized it, but the cartouche, which is just a fancy French word, this depicts something interesting. You have to look at it for a while to understand. So it's actually, it's a scene at the port showing wealthy planters selling their tobacco, but this was drawn by someone who had never been to Virginia, someone who lived in England. So it's slightly off if you really know what they're supposed to be depicting. The hogsheads would be much bigger than this. They wouldn't be shaped like a barrel, but more like a cylinder so that you could roll them easier. And I don't believe that they would have had such a fancy, smooth ashlar, stone construction tobacco warehouse like this. Probably a little fancier than real life. But very interesting, I think. It calls attention to the map itself. And like I say, one more person I like to call attention to down in the corner, Thomas Jeffries. He was the engraver of the map. So he didn't do the surveying, he just did the engraving where all of the maps were made from. So I think he's very important as well. I'd like to briefly cover a little few things about him. And first off, this is not a painting of him. This is Prince Frederick, namesake of Fredericksburg. But Thomas Jeffries was the royal engraver. So he was the engraver to Prince Frederick. And especially during the 7 Years' War, it was a big time where they needed maps of all of Virginia and the rest of the colonies for strategic military purposes. And then after that, he became the cartographer to King George III. So after Prince Frederick passed away, he was the father to King George and the son of King George II. So he never got to be king. And then after the map, he actually became bankrupt. So it didn't last very long, and then he died shortly after that. But another company started printing his maps. They just printed them for a long time afterwards. So I think he kind of got cheated on that deal. But anyway, just a brief overview of Thomas Jeffries before I continue. So back into the map. So when you're looking at this map, I know it's kind of hard to pick out what part is actually Virginia, or it was for me at least, because you're looking at this, it contains all these other parts of states with no modern boundaries of us. We know them, so I've tried to give you a couple different views to better understand this map. So I've filled in what's the modern boundary of Virginia, so you all can use this, and I will refer to this so we all know what we're looking at. So also another view, I have the states as we know them today as well. So it actually includes little bits of Tennessee, Kentucky. It contains almost all of what's now West Virginia, as well as a little bit of Ohio past the river up there. So it is very expansive. And then another main thing I want to point out before I start getting into smaller features is I mentioned in the Tidewater, there's a few roads, and I'll go over them. But there's a big area in the Piedmont where there's nothing, and then in the little valley here, there's this main road which has always been there. It's a great old Native American road. Some people call it the Great Warrior Road. This map calls it the Great Wagon Road to Philadelphia. And so it does lead from Philadelphia over all the way through Virginia, through Winchester and Stanton, and then down to a little place which is very interesting. It's now Winston-Salem, but on this map they have an acreage, about 100,000 acres, which is a settlement called Unitas, which is actually a Moravian German settlement. They moved down from Pennsylvania and acquired that land, and it was a very early, huge Moravian settlement that became Winston-Salem. So that's where the path went. And I'll, like I say, zoom more into this later, just so you get the overall view. And then to compare, it really did just follow the way that the natural Virginia shape goes. You see the big valley, the Shenandoah. So that great wagon road went right through the Shenandoah, and it did kind of drop off through what's now Roanoke. But further into the 1770s, 1780s, it did continue to follow more of the natural shape of Virginia. So one more view that I thought was interesting. So this is, I tried to zoom in and see where all the towns, all the cities, and all of the courthouses were, and kind of visualize that for everybody. So you can see kind of the distribution of settlement throughout the state or the colony at this time. So like I mentioned, very little settlement in the Piedmont region at this time. We have the two orange dots, which I do have them labeled here. So Williamsburg and Richmond, of course, the big ones. The furthest western settlements at this time were Stanton was just a courthouse, and then Winchester was a big town at this time as well. I'll zoom into there. That was the furthest west town that I could find on this map, or at least British colonized town. And so one more very important feature that this map kind of highlights on itself. So I'll zoom into this, but in the map, it has this orange outline for this shape. And so I looked more into it, and this is the northern neck. But during the 1750s, it's called the Fairfax Grant. And so I found this very fascinating if anyone's researched this. This was about 5 million acres and what's now about close to this area. And it was all owned by one person, Lord Fairfax. And so just a brief little background on how that came about, I thought it was interesting. So the northern neck was part of a land grant in the 1640s, so right after the English Civil War. And so it was granted to 7 British nobles, who only one of them actually lived in America. That was Lord Fairfax. And so several generations later, all of that land was either inherited or purchased by Thomas Fairfax. So he owned it all himself for quite a few decades. And so it was passed down. He Culpeper family, actually I skipped that part. The Culpeper family acquired this. It passed down, they married into the Fairfax family, which is the link to Thomas Fairfax. And so like I mentioned, he lived in Virginia, and but by the Revolution, they confiscated this land. So they took it all, and then he died during the Revolution. So after that point, the Fairfax grant and the Northern Neck Proprietary, as they knew it, did not exist after that. So very interesting that they would mark that as such a boundary in there. And that's also why I think there wasn't that many settlements or towns in that location, because it was all his grant. So to zoom in on that section, so at the very top of Virginia, I'm going to go from the top down. We have Fredericktown and Lord Fairfax. So they've got a lot of roads, like I mentioned. All of these western roads all kind of go towards Winchester, or as they call it, Fredericktown. So either of those names were good at that time. So you can see the purple road, it goes down to Fredericksburg. So that road leads to Fredericksburg. The other way, it leads up to what's the Ohio Company. It includes Fort Duquesne, also Fort Necessity, which in this map were actually drawn as part of Virginia and not Pennsylvania. The red road is the Great Wagon Road, which I showed from Pennsylvania down to North Carolina. Green Road goes to Alexandria, and then, like I say, actually Lord Fairfax is right in the center as well. He had a huge house. It was actually not meant to be his house. It was built as a hunting lodge. So it was this very neat, kind of 1.5-story, huge building. But he lived in that his whole life and never actually had the plantation house built. So just a little zoom in on Winchester there. You can see really how centered Winchester was. And this was right before they built Fort Loudon as well. So a lot of French and Indian war activity about to happen in this location. And then moving on down to where we are today. Fredericksburg, I know everyone wants to see that. So zoom in, you can see a red dot where Fredericksburg is. And so that purple road continues. It's the same road coming from Winchester. Goes down, there's actually a place this might be confusing to some people, Todd's Ordinary, which is not Todd's Tavern, which confused me as well. So Todd's Tavern is a Civil War site that's historically significant. It's further close to Wilderness. But this was a different spot, which I couldn't find information on, called Todd's Ordinary. I don't know if it was the same family. It goes further down to Port Royal, as well as the Mattaponi. It mentions all of the branches of the Mattaponi. And then down here, if you'll notice where I put the blue circle, something huge is missing, which is modern day Lake Anna. So of course, long before Lake Anna. And then at the very top, last thing, you can see both Germanna and the orange boundary, which they have drawn on that. I did not put the orange boundary. That is the Fairfax grant. So you can see that drawn on the map. And so moving on to where Fry and Jefferson live in Albemarle. So this is also why it was important that they were the ones to draw this map, because they lived in the center of the whole spot that they really needed to know more about. And so zooming into that, a few things. So first off, the river, I've colored it blue. It's the James, but in this map, once it branches off into the Rivanna, they call it the Fluvanna, all the way over to the mountains. But if you look on a map today, it still calls that the James. Slight difference. But you can see up the Rivanna, starting at the top, there's Lewis and Meriwether. Very important, familiar names. That is where the Lewis family lived, Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark. And so very close to Shadwell, which is the home of Peter Jefferson, where Thomas Jefferson grew up. And that's very close to where they built Monticello. And then further down a little bit, you can see Fry. So Fry is listed there just under Shadwell. They lived very close. So that was Fry's house. Over past the mountains into the valley, you can see the red, main wagon road. It goes through what's called Beverly's Manor, or the Irish Track. And that's in reference to Burgess William Beverly, who brought in a lot of Scotch-Irish settlers to that area. And then down a little further of note, on the map itself it says John Peter Sally. So it's a specific person that Fry and Jefferson consulted with in order to get more information about Augusta County. Because there was this German settler there who had taken a great journal, done his own surveying, and he had anglicized his name to John Peter Sally, but of course his name was actually Johann Sally. And without going too off point, he kept a very interesting journal. I do recommend reading it. Very short, but he actually had to rewrite it twice because the first time it was stolen. He went too far into the French territory and he was taken prisoner for I think 2 years in New Orleans. So they took his journal. He wrote it from memory when he came back, and then he loaned it to someone who didn't give it back, so he had to write it one more time. So we thankfully still have that third rendition. I hope it's not much more boring than the original. But either way, I still recommend John Peter. So that's where they got a lot of information for Augusta County. So next slide here. So, okay. So just to overview and show you kind of what the areas became as well. So this was just Albemarle and Augusta, but you can see it's about now 9 different counties. So they really split them up. And I'll have the same overview later on so you all can kind of conceptualize what the map actually is showing. So Lynchburg, Stanton, you can see those places as well. And then moving on down, my last main section of the map to look at is what they call Lunenburg County, and including all of the Roanoke River, so, or at least the part that's in Virginia. So starting at the Roanoke, of course, it starts in the Albemarle Sound, so it comes out of North Carolina, and then the Roanoke, which they named after the local word for that. And the word Roanoke is in reference to kind of, if you've heard of wampum, they're the native currency of the time, little shells. Roanoke is either a word for wampum or a different type of wampum. I'm still not sure what the correct definition is. And then Moratock is one of the original names for the river, which is usually not called that anymore. And going a little further, there was a section where there was islands within the Roanoke, and there was a native tribe who lived there called the Occaneechi as well. And if you've been to that area, you'll know it's still called Occaneechi, but it's since been filled in, like it's a reservoir now. So they've actually flooded out all of the islands, and they've lost a lot of the historic site. But the site's still called that. Further down, it splits into 2 different rivers. The first one upwards goes to the mountains. It's called either Smith's River or the Stanton River, named after the same thing as Stanton, the town. The bottom branch, going back to Colonel William Byrd, he named all of these places during his 1728 survey. So he named Dan River after a biblical reference from Dan to Beersheba, talking about the width of the travel they had to go to reach that. And then they also found these 2 Native American towns that were along the river. So closer was Lower Sarah Town, and then there was Upper Sarah Town. So this was a tribe in itself, the Sarah Native Americans. So they were kind of tied in with the Occaneechi, but by shortly after this survey, they had moved completely out of the area. And so a little bit more into this, just a different view of the same place, looking into some of the extra Jefferson family. So there's this other good quote that I found from Thomas Jefferson referencing that his grandfather had 3 sons, Thomas, who died young, and then it was Field, who settled the waters of Roanoke and left numerous descendants, and then Peter, my father. So I wanted to talk about Field Jefferson because I think that's interesting. So Field, there's actually on the right-hand side at the bottom near the river, there's a spot on the map that says Jefferson. So that's exactly where his uncle went to, or his granduncle. And so Field Jefferson had quite a few children, and 2 of his sons became very prominent in the area in Southern Virginia. So his son George Jefferson, who is not the one from the Jeffersons, the show, but George Jefferson, who lived a long time ago, he lived in what's now Mecklenburg. So he lived in Mecklenburg, but he owned land over where I have 8,000 acres there. He owned 8,000 acres in that little red square. while living over there. So he was also over a lot of the Mecklenburg County government. His brother, though, did move to what's now Pittsylvania County. So Peter Fry-Jefferson was his brother, who eventually acquired a lot of that land, about 2,000 acres, I think, and then eventually over time it became the land that the courthouse was on. And so I say all of this, I think it's notable because today it's actually very, very easy to find descendants of the Jefferson family in Pittsylvania County. In fact, there's a short story that just shows how common it is. One time, I think it was about 5 years ago, the local historical society had an event where you bring in pictures and they scan them and they make it into a book. And there was 3 people in there. I was one of them, and then 2 of them were crowded around looking at a Jefferson family picture because the other random person happened to come from the Jeffersons, and I also came from the Jeffersons. So these are 3 random people. We all happen to have a connection to this family, and there's, if I had to guess, thousands and thousands of Jefferson family descendants today in that area. And so I'm one of those as well. So very common, but very interesting, I think. And then last to mention at this view, at the very bottom, I mentioned Saratown, which did actually become a different important historic site. It was purchased by the Harston family. So if you know anything about the Harston family, they owned about 85% of what's now Henry County. Very, very wealthy, influential people. But they purchased what's now Saratown, named it that as his plantation, and it became a huge, huge plantation. So interesting to research that if you'd like. But really the last thing I have now is to, after this comparison, you can see where the modern day towns are. And actually the star right in the middle, that's a star for where I'm from. So you can kind of put that in perspective. So right exactly where those 8,000 acres were is where I'm from. So either way, so last thing I have to mention is to just show you all a depiction of kind of how this map was used decades later. So this was not just a one and done deal. They used this map for the next, I would say, 50 years to make different iterations, adding new things, changing things, fixing things, or also making new errors. And then so this is the map that I thought really embodied kind of the continuation of the map. So John Mellish's 1818 map. So you can see Virginia is now just a very tiny portion, but he did use this map to do that section of Virginia. And then by this time we had expanded, just purchased recently, the Louisiana purchase, and so they're calling most all of that Missouri. But like I said, great example. I know 1790s, especially, they did a lot more with this map. But this is really the first time that they had a full, what I call a full United States map. So. All right, so last thing is just to mention, closing, that I do have a website that I would feel free, I would love if you all would visit it or just learn more about what I like to do. I share a lot of preservation work, and like I mentioned, have a book. This is my most recent book that I've worked on. And I do have this available at the Rising Sun Tavern Museum, so it kind of goes over a lot of local cultural information for the Piedmont region of Virginia, so the middle section, and especially the rural, more tobacco farming communities. So that is available, and I'll put more of them into the Rising Sun Tavern Museum on this Friday. So try not to pick them up tomorrow, but if you do want one, try to go on Fridays. But that's about all I've got prepared. So, and of course, I would like to open it up for any questions that anybody might have at this time. So if y'all have a question, just raise your hand and I'll be glad to answer. You got one? I'm not sure, it's not like the common person would have had this map. I'm not sure where they would have had to go to plan that, but yes, I would say as soon as they had, access to it, they would have certainly tried their best to follow that. I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question. I don't feel like I have the best answer for it. So.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. A question in the back?
Am I the back?
Yes.
So ours is a very early reprint, you said?
Yes.
Is the original extant somewhere, and if so, where?
So I've heard that the very original, I believe it was passed down to Thomas Jefferson, And I think it was burnt in his house fire. I do believe that's what I've read somewhere. But yeah, there was a lot of copies of it made, and they're each called states. I don't know as much as I probably should about the different states, but yes, I do believe there was, I think there was only one of this particular state that we have, but overall about 20 of what I consider the early copies of it. Yeah. Way in the back?
As surveyed, did they travel throughout that entire area of the map, or did they use other people's maps?
Yeah, they would have surveyed, especially in Albemarle, because that's, the Jeffersons were the official county surveyors, but in reference to John Peter Sally, yeah, they completely relied on his surveys. Yeah, they went down to different sources for those areas. So yeah, it wasn't that they completely surveyed every bit of the state.
Do you have an idea of exactly where they did travel during that period?
Not really, other than just for certain that main North Carolina boundary, and then I would say all of Albemarle, probably also Fairfax, because they also had a lot of ties and business dealings with the Fairfax family and the Randolphs. I would imagine, because I do know that I forgot to mention that George Jefferson and both his brother as well both became the surveyors of Pittsylvania County. So if you're talking about the extended family, which you're not, but yeah, certainly they did. But yeah, just Peter Jefferson and Joshua Fry, I would say mostly Northern Virginia is where they stuck to. Alrighty, any other questions? Got one in the back?
How often did you find that they changed the names of the rivers?
It's a good question too. It really changes from map to map. And I've seen small changes, like one that comes to mind, I always look for in Pennsylvania County is the Pig River, because it's not named after the animal, it's named after the settlers who had the name P-I-G-G. And in this very first map, it has P-I-G, and a lot of the afterwards it's P-I-G-G. So that changed, but as far as like the whole different name, I would say if I had to give a percentage, or at least the ones that I was looking at, more than half of them have changed. But a lot of them also give two different names. So, is there a question there?
In many of the areas that you named on the map, there was an Indian presence there. Were they killed? Were they chased out? Because you were speaking about land that was passed down in families or given, by the British government and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not sure the whole process of how they got them out, because a lot of the references that I saw from the time of direct journal entries, even way back then, they talk like there was hardly any of them left. So it seems like they were driven out probably in the 1730s or 40s before the main 1750s and 60s settlement happened, because it's really hard. Yes, I was trying to find more information about the towns themselves, and it was, like I say, like they were talking about ghost towns 250 years ago. So very little information about them that I could find. Is there another question there?
When George Washington, as a surveyor, would he have gone up through the Alexandria route that you talked about to Northern Virginia? Or I think that's where George Mason was located as a surveyor. And
I would certainly imagine so,
do you
because
know which direction he took from the northern neck?
it would be a guess, but I would assume because he would have made visits to Fredericksburg and taken that road from Fredericksburg, because I know he didn't stay here and visit a lot in his later part of his life, but during that time, I do believe he probably would have taken that specific road. But yeah, that would be a guess. I haven't seen reference to that. Any question?
How many copies of the maps were made? Who got them, and how were they used?
That's also a great question that I don't know completely, but just on my own, thinking about it, I would assume that people tavern keepers especially would try their best to have a map like that. That would be someone was the center of a community, and people would go to them for questions like that of how to get places. So I would assume, it wouldn't be something that everybody had, but I would assume there was at least a couple copies in each major town. or at least in the courthouse. But yeah, I don't really know the extent of how many they made and who exactly they went to. It's a great question.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for